Hey everybody, this is lecture 11.1, and we're going to be talking about the substances we use, as in intoxicants, as in alcohol and other drugs. So we'll be talking about illegal drugs, then we'll be talking about legal drugs including alcohol. We'll then talk some about addiction, and then in lecture 11.2, we'll be talking a little bit more about how addiction impacts the body. So, many people assume that certain drugs are dangerous simply because they're illegal, and that is an assumption that we make in our society. However, if you really look into it and really break it down, the illegality of a drug doesn't always sync up with the danger of it. If you look at the medical side effects and the medical impacts of long use alcohol use versus long use marijuana use, you'll see that, right? It is medically not possible to overdose on marijuana, at least traditional strains of marijuana. While alcohol, it's relatively easy to overdose, and you can probably drive to the store right now and buy what would be considered a lethal amount of alcohol. And that would be completely legal to purchase that amount of alcohol. Similarly, actually, when we're talking about legality and illegality, in some parts of the country, still marijuana is illegal, but certain strains of synthetic marijuana are legal. Those synthetic strains of marijuana, many of them are actually very dangerous for health. That's actually a major problem in Europe, not so much in the United States. There are various types of synthetic marijuana that, oops, sorry, I don't know if you saw a difference there. There are various types of synthetic marijuana that are really causing major problems in urban areas there. We saw a similar problem a couple years ago with the drugs called bath salts. And those drugs actually, in most cases, in many areas, are completely legal. But the fact of the matter is that they are incredibly dangerous. There are three general categories of drugs. These categories aren't absolutely all-encompassing, but they are useful categories for understanding drugs. Stimulants are those drugs that stimulate the central nervous system. They make the user feel like they're full of energy. We have depressants that reduce the activity of the nervous system. Depressants make the user feel relaxed. Alcohol falls in here. The drugs that were once known as quaaludes, they fall in here. Any drug that would take down the activity level of the individual. Downers, they're sometimes called. And then hallucinogens, and these are sometimes called psychedelics. These are drugs that disrupt the nervous system and they change the user's perception of reality. This would include drugs such as hallucinogenic mushrooms, LSD, Molly, those sorts of things. Now, marijuana fits into all three categories, namely because that plant and cannabis as an entire entity, when you have cannabis oil not broken down into other things, it is a stimulant, it is a depressant, and it is a hallucinogen. It's all three of those things, and it's largely dependent both on the strain of the plant grown and on the impact on the user's body. Now, the two major chemicals in marijuana, THC, is largely the component that creates what you could call hallucinogenic factors, but it does those other things. There's also another component called CBD that CBD oil in particular is legal in most parts of the United States now. That has more downer type effects. There you go. And marijuana is and was the most widely used illegal drug in the United States. Again, it's important to keep in mind that it is legal or semi-legal in most areas. Marijuana is still federally illegal, right? So even if you are in a place where it is legal by state law, even in California, even in Colorado, it's still federally illegal. What that effectively means, though, is that it's harder for federal agents to prosecute. Many argue that there are serious health hazards, both in the short term and the long term, in smoking marijuana. When people talk about the health hazards of marijuana, they're usually talking about smoking the plant in and of itself, and that would be similar to unfiltered tobacco. If you smoke unfiltered tobacco cigarettes, those are about the same health hazards, or smoking cigars, that sort of thing. Others argue that moderate use is less dangerous than alcohol or smoking. For example, you would, if you were a regular marijuana smoker, you would smoke less marijuana than the average regular tobacco smoker would. So if you're just looking at smoking, if you're talking about things like edibles, if you're talking about other ways of consuming their marijuana, then the damage to your lungs would be lesser. I personally haven't seen medical reports on those other avenues of consumption. Now, marijuana is legal for recreational use in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Vermont, and Massachusetts. So in those areas, it's legal for use on the state level, but it is still federally illegal. Marijuana is legal for medicinal use in Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Hawaii, North Dakota, Minnesota, Arkansas, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Florida, New York, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. So we're looking at about half of the states. It's legal in one way or another. Now, I'll tell you, I live in Ohio. I don't know what the situation is in New Mexico. It is technically legal for medical use, but it's pretty hard to get access to it. And as of the date of recording, we don't actually have dispensary locations in Ohio. We don't have, there aren't licenses. There is basically the law structure for it, but we don't have the internal distribution mechanisms to make that actually a thing. It's my understanding, effectively, that people are working on it, but it's not quite there yet. And as I just said, marijuana is still illegal on the federal level, and it is important to keep that in mind, especially when you're traveling. If you are someone that, for example, uses medical marijuana for a medical condition, you really want to look at state laws, especially when traveling between cities, to make sure that you don't wind up with drug trafficking charges for using your medicine. Now let's talk about heroin, right? It's a big jump between marijuana and heroin. Heroin was first produced in 1898. It was made by the Bayer Corporation, same corporation that makes Bayer aspirin, right? Same corporation that makes a lot of completely legal drugs. And the reason why Bayer created heroin was that it was intended to replace morphine as, quote, a less addictive alternative. Heroin is absolutely more addictive than morphine, but they didn't really know that at the time. Heroin is physically and psychologically addictive. Some drugs are just psychologically addictive, especially hallucinogens. They don't necessarily have that physical addiction quality, but heroin absolutely has that physical addiction quality to it. And as the center of the current opioid crisis, heroin has been the focus of several social scientific studies. So we actually do have a fair amount of knowledge of how heroin not only impacts the individual, but how heroin impacts communities. One study found, and this is really talking about physical addiction, that a lot of heroin users don't use heroin to get high even. They don't even care about the high anymore. They use it to keep from suffering from withdrawal, right? And that's the really horrid thing about heroin addiction is the heroin addict doesn't even care about getting high. They just know they have to inject every so many hours or every day or every couple days to keep from withdrawal symptoms that basically resemble a really bad flu, right? So they know if they don't shoot up with heroin every day or so, they'll come down with the flu. And that is, I can't even imagine how horrible that is. Um, Many addicts report, using it simply to feel normal so that they don't come down with that withdrawal. Now, recent research has shown an incredibly strong connection between the use of legal painkillers and heroin. So, during the war on drugs, we talked about marijuana as a gateway drug to other drugs, and that's since been almost entirely debunked. But legal painkillers, so other opiates that are based off the same opium poppy plants that's used to make heroin, a lot of painkillers are based off that same drug, right? So people are using things like Oxycontin. People are using other legal painkillers that they might get for back pain. And as their addiction builds, they maybe can't get those prescriptions anymore. And as their addiction builds, they maybe can't work, they don't have as much money, and there are some parts of the country where heroin is easier to get than prescription painkillers. And because of that, and because heroin does about the same thing to the body, and because heroin doesn't have to be injected, it can be snorted, at least for a while, then those legal drugs act as a gateway to heroin. And that is where the opiate crisis is happening, and that's why it's happening, and that's why we have so much heroin abuse in this country now, is because a lot of people were over-prescribed drugs. It's really terrifying stuff. Cocaine. Both heroin and cocaine are these white powders. They do radically different things. Cocaine is processed from coca plants. I think I spelled coca wrong there. And are mostly grown in Colombia. Coca is actually, it's different from the stuff that cocoa, right, they use to make chocolate. It's a completely different thing. Coca is actually used by Colombians as a low-grade stimulant, similar to coffee. So if you would go to Colombia and you would, say, do a little bit of mountain climbing that you do a lot in Colombia, they would give you these leaves that you would chew, and you chew them as you're going up the mountain, and it gives you a little bit of a stimulant, a lot like strong coffee, and it helps you adjust to the high elevation. That coca leaf is what they make cocaine out of. So powder cocaine is it's made out of those leaves that are used for a very practical purpose in Colombia. Now, crack that's not entirely accurate. Crack is a modified form of cocaine. It's not a less pure form of cocaine. But it produces a more intense high because users smoke crack while typically they snort cocaine. You can freebase smoke cocaine, but it's more common to snort it. And there are different effects of freebase smoking cocaine and crack as well. There are serious race issues surrounding crack and powder cocaine. When the war on drugs hit in the 1980s, heavy emphasis was put on crack cocaine, and less emphasis was put on powder cocaine. And powder cocaine was being used by rich white people and didn't really get a stigma associated to it. It got some, but not as much, while crack users tend to be poor black people, or at least poor inner city people. And because of that, a lot more emphasis was put on stopping crack as opposed to stopping powder cocaine that was being used by more influential people. So, the possession of 28 grams of crack cocaine yields a 5-year minimum sentence for the first offense. Okay? So, and this is the difference in drug laws, right? Crack cocaine, again, you're more likely to be in possession of crack cocaine if you're a drug user who's poor and black. 28 grams will get you 5 years in jail, which is still, 28 grams is still a lot of crack, but not a massive amount of crack. Now, 500 grams of powder cocaine, that's what you need to get that same 5 years in jail, right? 500 grams, that's a drug dealer. It's a low-grade drug dealer. It's enough to be drug dealing for a little bit, but 500 grams versus 28 grams of crack, it's not even comparable. It's ridiculous. So basically, it's almost guaranteeing that the poor black user is dramatically more likely to be put in prison for their drug use as opposed to the rich white user. Now let's talk about meth. Methamphetamine is made from otherwise legal components. That's a thing to keep in mind. Meth is most typically smoked. It is possible to inject or snort it, but that requires a little bit of nuance, a little bit better product. Meth leads to suppression of appetite, euphoria, and bursts of energy. The negative side effects of methamphetamine use include depression and paranoia, especially depression after the crash of the drug, as well as physical side effects, the infamous meth mouth, other tissue breakdown, and those sorts of things. Roofies, completely different kind of drug. Roofies are a depressant related to Valium, except Rohypnol roofies are 10 times stronger than Valium. Roofies are sold over the counter at 60 plus countries to treat severe insomnia. So there are countries where Rohypnol is illegal. It is illegal in the United States, and that is because it is used as a date rape drug. It's effectively used to drug people so that they can be raped. Roofies are almost never used for recreational purposes, namely because if you take a roofie, you're just going to fall asleep. Most drug users want to be conscious and high for a while, even if they take a nap later, right? Rohypnol is just for raping people. If you ever meet somebody that's in possession of roofies, they're not using them to get high, they're trying to rape people. So use that as a gauge of character, if you will. Ecstasy, another kind of drug, also known as MDMA, X, or Molly. Molly's probably the more common name with young people. Now, I'm such an old man calling it ecstasy from the 90s. Ecstasy alters moods, leads to feelings of happiness and a connection of others. It's said to give a new perspective on life, but excessive doses may cause brain damage due to overheating in the brain. So that's an issue. Ecstasy is most commonly used in subcultures surrounding 90s rave culture. Ecstasy was big in the late 90s. And also New Age spiritualists. So there are some people, especially MDMA, especially with things like ayahuasca, right? There are some people exploring the spiritual components, if you will, to ecstasy, using it in a more tame kind of process. There are studies looking at using this drug in particular in dealing with things like PTSD and addiction to other drugs. But with that said, it is still a drug that absolutely is capable of being abused and capable of damaging the body through prolonged use. And let's talk about a few theories of drug use relatively quickly. We have biological theories of drug use, and those biological theories look at inborn predisposition to addiction. So if your whole family, alcoholism runs in your family, then that might be an issue for you that you should be aware of. Another thing are psychological theories. So trance causes specific personality traits. Okay. Anyway, that's a misleading thing right there. I should have modified that before I gave the presentation. What that means, that's a major typo. Certain personality traits, such as low self-esteem, low self-esteem, paranoia, depression, those kinds of problems, those can cause problems with drug dependence and drug use. That's what that means. Sorry about that major and weird typo. Let's look at some sociological theories on this, though. Some sociological theories interpret drug use as stemming from social forces. So if you're part of a subculture or a drug subculture, or your friends use drugs, that will dictate how you see drug use. Do you see drug use as a bad thing? Do you see drug use as a semi-bad thing? Or whatever. Economic deprivation theory suggests a strong link between drug use and deprivation. Basically what economic deprivation theory states is people do the deviance that they do because they're stuck in a tough economic situation. So if you're really poor and you have no prospects, that could lead you to drinking or using other drugs. That's effectively what that means. We have cognitive association theory, which states that addicts' continuing interests in the drug has to do with withdrawal distress, right? And that's what we see in the form of heroin and other opiates. That's what you see with any drug that has a strong withdrawal component to it, right? Is that users just keep a little bit of the drug in their system to try to keep that really bad feeling from happening. And then you could look at a multi-factor theory. So you could look at sociological factors, you could look at psychological factors, you could look at biological factors, you can look at all of those. And all of those multi-factors are what keep people addicted. Addiction is not an easy thing. It's a really tough thing to have to deal with, right? So you have to deal with the entire person. And you can't just cut the person off of the substance and assume they're going to get all better. You have to cut them off of the substance and try to fix the parts of their life, parts of their setting in society, the parts of their brain that are broken that makes them more prone to using drugs. Now, with that said, we can talk about the war on drugs. The war on drugs was started in the 1980s. It was championed by First Lady Nancy Reagan, and it shaped both law enforcement policy and education policy. So it was all about trying to keep young people in particular, so kids and high schoolers, from ever using drugs in the first place. The war on drugs consisted of two basic strategies. It was both punitive and supportive. So heavy use of drug enforcement to stop the supply of drugs, right? So pour massive amounts of money into police departments to catch those criminals, and then using drug prevention and treatment to stop the drug problem. Now, in the war on drugs, a lot of emphasis was put on the punitive. A lot of emphasis was putting into drug prevention, so actually discouraging kids from using drugs and those sorts of things. But not much emphasis was put on helping addicts once they already were addicted. Those kinds of programs developed more in the 90s and early 2000s, and they're a lot better than they used to be. But in the 1980s, a lot of emphasis was not put into rehabilitation. And the war on drugs has been criticized for ballooning prison populations and deepening race issues, namely a lot of it with that indiscrepancy between powder cocaine and crack cocaine and demographic factors in how those drugs are used. Because if you look at the sociological research, all classes of people, all racial groups, right, barring some religious groups and those social factors. But if you look at class and you look at race, everyone basically uses drugs at the same rate, right? Not everyone uses drugs, mind you, but The same percentage of black people uses drugs as the same percentage of white people, as the same percentage of Latino people. The same percentage of poor people use drugs as middle class people, as upper class people. It's all a matter of people's ability to not get put in prison for using drugs. So let's talk about some legal drugs. The combined harm of legal drugs is actually much greater than the harm of illegal drugs. Two legal drugs include alcohol and tobacco. And alcohol and tobacco kill at least 60 times as many Americans annually as do all other legal drugs combined, right? We know that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. We know that people die from liver failure and drunk driving and due to their alcoholism. But those things remain legal. More middle class people are abusing prescription drugs, especially painkillers, and that's what we're talking about as far as class issue goes. I take back a slight bit of what I said. There is, if we look at economic deprivation theory, a stronger tendency for some lower class individuals when they're right on the edge of breaking to sometimes use drugs. But so that would make the rates of drug use among poor people higher, a little higher, not a lot higher, but a little higher. But recently, because of the opiate crisis, because there are so many opiates in our society, then it is working its way up into the middle classes, right? And only really upper class and upper class people can afford actually going to rehab, right? That's not available to all of us. So those of us that don't have the money to send ourselves to Hawaii to detox, right? We have to deal with this thing. Oxycontin abuse has steadily increased over the last decade. Oxycontin, a legal painkiller, and this is leading to widespread abuse and intensified regulation of Oxycontin and similar types of drugs, Valium, etc. And as I mentioned, it is a leading contributor to the heroin epidemic. So here we see, from 1965 to 2003, the change in pain in drug use over time. There's a couple interesting things to say here. So you see, note that heavy black line. Let's see if I get my mouse to come up. This one. You see how it's down here with all that, and then it skyrockets. That's the opiate epidemic, right? That's what we're dealing with. Tranquilizers, those are a slightly different drug, but we do see them move at around the same kind of motion, as painkillers. So it might be that some people are using tranquilizers in their addiction patterns to opiates. Stimulants, so things like cocaine, we see a big spike in it in like 1975 and then another one in 1980. This was kind of the heyday of especially powder cocaine, but also crack cocaine. And then those dipped really hard in the 1990s, and they come back a little bit in the early 2000s. But again, it's not the same as our heroin use. And then this is an interesting one, sedatives. So in 1980, we see a heavy drop in sedative use. That's what I mentioned, Quaaludes, right? A lot of you might not even know what Quaaludes are. Quaaludes were a type of sedative, a downer, that were effectively eliminated by they were effectively eliminated by the war on drugs. That is the one success of the war on drugs, is they eliminate Quaaludes. Quaaludes, effectively, the impact on the body would be similar to getting really drunk. And those are gone now, for better or worse. So, tobacco. Smoking it's absolutely a lethal drug. If you use tobacco properly for X number of years, you'll get cancer. 25% of Americans continue to smoke regularly, and actually teenage smoking has recently increased. That is largely attributed to the introduction of certain different flavors of tobacco, clove cigarettes, for example, and tobacco mints sometimes being used by teenagers. While smoking has declined in the United States since 1960, it has increased in developing countries. This is due to a lack of requirement warning restrictive ads. Everyone knows in society that smoking is bad for you. But if those ads aren't there reminding people that smoking is bad for them, the general thinking, social scientifically wise, is you're not given that reminder. You're not given that reminder to stop smoking when you have the pack in your house. Women and youth smoking has actually increased around the world since the 1960s. Let's talk about alcohol. Ooh, sorry, had to yawn. Alcohol is the most widely used drug in the United States, and alcohol is abused more than other drugs in the United States. Here are some statistics about alcohol use. About 7% of the U.S. population is an alcoholic, but about 63% of Americans drink alcoholic beverages. And these statistics are about moderate compared to other countries. There are other countries, other cultures, German society, a lot of European cultures, they drink a whole lot more than we do. If you compare the alcohol use, say, in Russia to that of the United States, the Russians drink a whole lot more than we do. So there is alcohol use in the United States, but compared to some other societies, we kind of have it under control. Let's talk about some impacts on the individual. So, alcohol plays a part in many crimes, actually. Alcohol is a depressant. It reduces the mental capacity of the body. It reduces body functional activity, so you're not as quick to respond when using alcohol, right? That's why drunk driving is a bad thing, right? But it's important to keep in mind, alcohol does not decrease a drinker's moral competence, even though the public believes it. So, just because, and there have been psychological studies on this, just because somebody's really drunk doesn't mean they suddenly think it's wrong to, they suddenly don't know it's wrong to hurt somebody, or they don't know it's wrong to rape somebody. If somebody rapes somebody when they're drunk, it's still rape, because that knowing that rape is wrong doesn't go away. If somebody murders somebody when they're drunk, it's not a defense, because alcohol impairment doesn't make you a murderer. I've drank a fair amount in my life. I am a pacifist, and I've never hurt somebody physically while drinking. It doesn't change you in that way. And here are proportion of state prisoners who were under the influence of alcohol when committing violent crimes. So, alcohol, now this may sound contradictory, but it doesn't change your morality, but it does change your inhibitions, right? So if you are somebody that would be inclined to hitting your spouse, then if you drink alcohol, basically that switch turns off, right? So if you're somebody who would kill somebody, and then you drink, but you're being kept in check by being sober, and then you drink, and then that turns off, then you do the thing. Then you rape. Then you do those violent crimes, right? And it isn't as much that people break the law when they're drunk. It's that people sometimes getting ready to break the law might have a couple drinks ahead of time. So there are factors. Everyone drinks differently, right? If you do drink. Your body size and weight influence the amount you can drink. Your percentage of alcohol in a given beverage. So if you're a liquor drinker versus being a beer drinker, the amount of food in the stomach obviously makes a difference. The individual's tolerance for alcohol makes a difference. And there are long-term social, psychological, and even physical benefits of moderate alcohol use. Again, some societies drink a lot more alcohol than we do and have lower rates of alcoholism than we do. However, heavy drinkers definitely harm their health. So it's relative, and this is why alcoholism is complex, right? Because some people can use alcohol, some people can have 2 drinks a day and be super, super healthy with it. Other people, if they start drinking, they drink a whole lot, and they damage their body and they damage their relationships. Excessive use of alcohol brings about negative social consequences. This creates auto accidents and death, especially among young people. Auto accidents and drunk driving accidents are leading cause of death. And it also can have an influence on the crime rate, again, among those people that are inclined to do crime. Okay, that was a good chunk of a lecture. And there will be another one after this for this segment. I will talk to you later.